Right, I think it's midday now, so I think we're going to crack off, if that's all right. So welcome to everybody who's arrived to the latest in our series of webinars. Today we've got Patrick and Ali as usual, and they've been joined by Sean O'Hare, who is a bit of an expert on all things remuneration. And remuneration is a very complex and emotional subject. So they're going to be talking about that today, and would like to encourage you. Part of the beauty of these webinars is the questions that the audience ask. They would ask you to ask them, and if you could please use the Q&A. If you see at the bottom of your screen, there's a little green box which says Q&A. That just means that then they get recorded, and we can come back to them. So no more ado, I'm going to hand over to Ali. Thank you very much, and hope you all enjoy the next hour. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Leslie, and welcome everyone. I see some names that are recognised from previous webinars, and to those of you that are joining us for the first time, welcome to you. As Leslie said, please do join in with questions. A really interesting topic. CEO pay is, of course, normally scrutinised a great deal by shareholders, by organisations themselves, by employees, but of course at times of financial distress, as we're in currently, CEO pay is even more going to be under the spotlight. So what we wanted to do was have a conversation today, really from sort of a number of different perspectives, but taking in the benefit of having Patrick with his chairing experience and Sean with his extensive experience with remuneration committees, primarily as a sounding board, I think, an advisor, to really sort of talk through some of the issues and challenges and also the themes and trends that we're seeing. So welcome, Patrick, welcome, Sean. I wanted to get us started, if I can, just perhaps asking you, Sean, could you just talk through perhaps some of the themes that you see and some of the challenges in this particular time facing remuneration committees and boards?
Well, I used to say it was exciting to be on a remuneration committee, but I'm not so sure this year. Quite a lot of challenges. Of course, most remuneration committees have been very busy already. They've had to deal with not only the downturn in the economy on the board, but also what does that mean for pay in the first half of the year? Did they do anything about deferring pay or reducing base pay, etc.? They've also been trying to take into account anything that happened at the AGMs in April, May, June. That might help them think about next year. And then for those organisations that have taken government money or reduced the dividends, shareholders have come out with various views as to what that should mean in respect of bonus outturns for 2020. So I think there's a lot of challenges as remuneration committees, especially in listed companies, as they go into, if they're a December year end, they usually have a meeting around November, December, to look at the outturn for this year, and maybe in January to look at what they're going to do for next year. So lots of different issues I think we'll probably cover in the next hour or so.
Good. And Patrick, what about you? What are some of the things that you're observing? I know when we originally started these pandemic webinars, one of the first things we commented on was the number of companies that fairly quickly announced CEO pay cuts, pay deferral. How have things progressed since there?
Yeah, well, I suppose I see a number of things. I think on that last point you've made, I think some people announced a cut, but actually the management thought it was a deferral. So I think the need for clarity, it always in remuneration and good communication has been an issue. And where I've heard and seen of problems, often the root of it has been poor communication around that. I think the second theme is around the interdependency and interplay between stakeholders. I mean, Sean rightly raised the point about shareholders and dividends. I think it's interesting this morning, the regulators saying, banks should be cautious still about paying dividends. And I guess if you're not paying dividends, not paying bonuses, all of those, there's an interplay between those things. There is also I think what's happened in this year with COVID, with Black Lives Matter, with a number of other things, the US election is, I think emotions are high, and fairness and equity and principles have come to the fore. And so I think whatever you're going to do around remuneration, you have to be, I think I'm getting quite a lot of background noise. I don't know if someone's not on mute. whatever you, that's better. Whatever you do, it has to be seen to be equitable as well as being fair. So I think that's an issue. I think the other thing that's an interplay between executive remuneration that matters deeply is the overall pay policy. So I think the Remcos have been involved more this year in overall pay policy more than perhaps they have before, because you've had people on furlough, you've had people taking cuts, a lot of people moving to part-time. All of these sorts of things have been issues that Remcos had to get involved in. Then you have the final two issues, which I think are around COVID tiering, which is kind of like those companies that have done really well from COVID, and loads of people have really worked exceptionally hard, been incredibly skillful, and really deserve a bonus this year, and are in companies that can actually pay it. However, the perception of people profiteering from COVID is not a good look, and so there's that issue. And the final one, which is something we talked about before, Ali, is around board churn. So I think just as we're seeing churn on boards, I think driven by the factors that we discussed before, I think you're also seeing a reasonable amount of churn on Remcos. And the Remco chairing is, particularly in a public company, is something you need to have quite a bit of experience and knowledge to do. And so there's quite a churn, and churn means different perspectives, different opinions. So I can see there's a lot of kind of issues around and really support everything Sean said.
I mean, we've interestingly, we started off saying we were going to talk about remuneration of CEOs, and we've immediately had a question from Simon Burke. Thank you very much for extending the topic to talking about non-exec director pay. So Simon said Aviva have announced a review of NED pay, given previous mistakes made by the board, and it would be interesting if we could touch on that, and I'm sure both of you will have some interesting opinions. But Sean, I wanted to just dive in and say, and there's a lot of complex. We talk a lot about CEO pay, and in the past, organisations have been accused of making pay very complicated, and there's been a trend towards trying to simplify things. And I sort of get a sense that COVID, of course, has increased the complexity of how organisations are operating. But does this really mean that we need to make that CEO compensation needs to become more complex, or actually should remuneration committees be holding on line with their policy?
Well, it was interesting this year that at the AGM season in April and May, there were a number of companies that tried to simplify their arrangements. As you probably know, in the very large companies, about 60% of the value of the package is in the long-term incentive plan, and those traditionally have been awarding some shares, their performance conditions over 3 years. At the end of 3 years, see what's best, and then you own the shares, but in the current environment, you don't sell them for at least over 2 years. But there's been a gradual move by a few companies, and I think there are about 7 or 8 this year, that have introduced what's called restricted share plans. And the reason, there's a few reasons for this. One, it reduces uncertainty. So instead of having the complex performance conditions over 3 years, what you do is you say that I'll have some underlying performance. I will take into account the performance of the business, but I'll reduce the award I give to you because it's predictable. The reduction is on average 50%. So you get 50% less shares awarded up front, but they vest at the end of 3 years, and then you will retain it. That has been regarded by most shareholders as a good simplification and a step forward. It has been around for many years, but there have been a number of attempts by companies to introduce it, and some of them have not always got shareholder support. So I think going forward, we're going to see businesses looking at this mix of the package, the base pay, the annual bonus, and the long-term incentive, and we may get on pensions, but that's a whole different issue. And looking at the mix of the package and saying, can we simplify? One way, potentially, is this use of restricted shares. Whether this is the year to introduce it or not, there's a lot of issues around that. It may be, if you're going forward, a remuneration committee thinks, I can't predict the next 3 years and where the business is going to be. So how can I possibly put in stretch performance risks in a long-term incentive program? That may be one factor that would lead you down the road of simplification. So I think remuneration committees have a lot to consider as they're going into this year. They will want to look at their bonus rate to see whether the stretch is appropriate. And it's interesting on that. Already some companies have made a move. Normally you set your performance conditions for the next 12 months, of course, if you're a December year-end company. Some have said we're only going to set performance conditions for 6 months, and a few have said 3 months. And then they're going to, at the end of that period, look to see what would be an appropriate stretching performance condition for the beginning.
It's a little bit difficult to hear you, Patrick. I don't know if...
Sean. Yeah.
Sorry, Sean. It's a little bit difficult to hear you. I don't know if you can maybe turn your volume up a little bit.
Oh, okay. Let's try that.
That's better. If you're
better?
sitting forward, I think when you're sitting forward with your volume up, it's a bit better. Yeah.
I'll lean in then, as they say.
Yes, that's much better, actually. Yeah, much better. You need to lean in.
Lean in. Okay.
Okay, so really interesting perspective. So prior to COVID, there were some trends in terms of this different approach to share plans and incentive plans, moving away from the long-term incentive plans. And now what you're saying is that you're seeing this sort of shortening of performance targets, which is driven by the context that we're operating in.
Yes, that's within the annual bonus plan. So normally it'd be the 12 months, and I think many organizations are saying it's so difficult to predict what's going to be appropriate for a 12-month period, never mind a 3-year period. So perhaps we'll review them. Of course, what it's going to mean is that shareholders will expect a lot better communication as we go forward. So it's not just a free pass to say, well, we'll look at the end of 3 months and look back and decide what the performance measure was. You've got to set it and be very clear about why you've gone for those performance measures. It means a lot more work also for non-executive directors and the Remuneration Committee, but it may mean that it's a more motivational incentive plan if in fact people believe that the targets are reasonable and achievable.
Yeah. Patrick, I wonder if you have had any experiences of different types of incentive plans kicking in because of COVID.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So one of the worlds I have a sort of fairly in-depth window on is the private equity world. And one of the things that's happened in a lot of private equity investments is the exit that many people were planning for 2020 just didn't happen and got delayed further. And the interesting thing around private equity and incentive alignments is it's all about the value when you sell. So one of the interesting things is it's equity based as opposed to bonus based typically. So people tend to have a market based salary, maybe a bit of a bonus, but actually the big win is in the sale of the company. And in some sectors, the valuations have created, the multiples paid for companies in a certain sector, but you still need management to be incentivized. So what some private equity firms have done is allow management to invest a bit more. So they're not getting a free option, if you like. They're actually allowed to invest at what now is maybe a lower valuation, and that's quite interesting. The other thing is, I think there's been more emphasis in private equity land, I think, on overall pay policy as opposed to just the executive, because they want people really motivated to get through the crisis and do well beyond. So they're accepting, okay, so maybe the exit's 2 years, maybe even 3 years delayed. We need to motivate people. So actually that motivation plan that we had in, which was predicated on an exit this year, that's not going to happen. So how do we do that? But how do we do that in a fair way for the shareholders as well as the people? That's one thing. Around the other sorts of environment, I think quite a lot of non-execs have had, they basically just said at the beginning of this, look, don't pay me for another year, we'll let it rack up, but don't absorb the cash on paying me on the board, because they've not felt comfortable with staff taking 80% pay or going down to 80% and then carrying on with the same fee. I think there's an issue around whether it's cash as well. So those companies that have got substantial cash reserves, obviously have had more flexibility to go down the deferral route. Those companies that have more constrained cash, obviously it's harder for them to go down the deferral route, and they've just gone for the reduction route. I think a lot of people also, and it's got more confused now, have, you know, there's much more flexible working, not just in the sense of working in or outside the office, but in terms of when you work, what sort of, if there was a total number of days, how you work. So a lot of people have gone down to, you know, 4-day weeks. But my sense is from the non-execs that I know, I mean, maybe it's not a representative sample, but they've generally been driven by what they think is the right thing to do. But what they've found is doing what they think is the right thing to do has actually helped them communicate the other decisions they've had to take for other people across the organisation, even the executive. And it's very hard to tell a CEO, you need to take a deferral, but I need to keep taking my non-exec fee.
Mm. So your sense is that the sort of fairness and the right thing to do is actually front of people's minds, and you're seeing some good practice around that. I wonder if we might talk a bit about the dividend payments and how that links into CEO pay and even non-executive director pay, and what the challenges are, because the sort of advice is, you know, don't pay dividends just yet.
Yeah, I mean, I've got some views, but Sean, you?
Well, it's very interesting. The shareholders have a view on this, and the Investment Association, which used to be part of the group, used to be part of the ABI. The Investment Association is a group that coordinates views in respect of insurance companies and pension funds in the UK. And they updated their guidelines only yesterday. And it's interesting that what they have said in their guidelines for the coming review period is that any company that has suspended dividends should clearly communicate how it has had, quote, a corresponding impact on remuneration, close quote, including the use of malice to roll back bonuses paid earlier this year in respect of 2019, if appropriate. So it's very interesting, and that's only one view. There are a number of other views that I think Legal and General came out and talked about if you took government money or suspended dividends, then you should reduce or eliminate bonuses. So I think the payment of dividends, the views here from shareholders, and I'm sure it'll be echoed by remuneration committees, is that you need to take the view in the round. So what's the experience been for the shareholder community? What's it been for the employees, even our customers? And it shouldn't just be based on whether or not we've had a good or a bad year, because we might have had windfall profits, and some companies have had windfall profits. So I think there's an overarching view here, at least by some of the shareholders, that if you have suspended dividend, then you need to think quite seriously about how it will impact, particularly on the bonus, and you need to communicate that in the annual accounts and what decision you've arrived at.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, the one thing I tend to do is, I think if you've got a proper, Sean, I wonder if you could go on mute when.
Yeah, sorry,
There's something not quite right. Yeah, that's better. Thank you. There's something not quite right with your microphone, but we'll join you back in a second. So I think if you've got a proper stakeholder strategy, so you know who your, you know, critical stakeholders are, whether they be shareholders, staff, suppliers, community, whatever they might be. But I think every decision you take around such an emotive topic, you have to go through just that simple, rigorous process of going, you know, how will this be seen by that group? Is this fair to that group? As a board, we have to balance the needs of all of our stakeholders. How does that play out? And I think the other thing is, I've always found it helpful when I've been in meetings to have one more junior person from the organisation present in the room, because they will tell you how this will go down with the staff. Not always right, it's only the view of one young person, but it's often very helpful. The other thing around dividends is, I think it's obviously very easy to say stop paying dividends, But the other question, I think, for every Remco around every decision is, what are the consequences of these things? So it's not just how it will look, what are the actual consequences? And one of the very unfortunate consequences of, a sudden stop in dividends from many organizations is that large numbers of people in the charity sector have been very adversely impacted by that, because many charities, particularly those that have an endowment, depend on their annual income. That's what they give away each year, or a big proportion of that. And if that's stopped, they're not going to get much by way of anything on their debt instruments. If the dividend income stops, then they're either going to have to eat into reserves or cut their grants. And so that's quite a big issue, and that is writ even larger in the pensions industry. So I think it's up to each board to be responsible for its own operations and not be responsible for the macro. But you have to bear in mind some of these issues and the interplay. So I think it's about the consequences first, and then how might they be perceived.
And I think actually you raise an interesting point, which also applies to listed companies. I mean, there were changes to the UK Corporate Governance Code that came in from January 2019. And one of the changes in there is that boards and remuneration committees should be taken into account not only the pay of the wider workforce, but the views of the workforce. And interestingly, it talks about the workforce, not just employees. And how have you taken into account the views of the workforce in setting your pay? Some organizations have appointed non-executive directors to represent and go and canvass views in some way from employees. One or two have actually gone out to appoint and elected an employee to be a non-executive director on the board, and therefore would bring their thoughts on the views. But there's increased, not only gather views, but there's also this year an increased requirement under Section 172 to disclose how you've taken into account the views of stakeholders, including employees. So to your point, Patrick, it's not just a quick decision on one business issue, it's how you take into account the views of everyone. And it'll be very interesting to see in the annual accounts the quality of communication around this when the reports start to be published March onwards.
Yeah.
I mean, Capita is one of those companies, I think, that appointed the employee non-exec. I mean, we probably should answer Simon's question, though, around, I think we won't comment specifically on Aviva, but the idea of a review of non-executive pay. I think, I mean, most remuneration reviews, comprehensive ones, will incorporate that, I guess, Sean. But actually, a lot of non-exec remuneration kind of gets stuck. It's kind of done on the basis of it's the same for everyone, and then maybe an extra payment if you chair a committee. And, there's that sort of matrix that you usually see, and it doesn't normally rise that much with inflation and all the rest of it. But it probably is. I mean, I think most chairs of Remcos should, at regular interviews, think about non-exec pay just as they think about executive pay. I mean, it's just a common sense thing. So my view, Simon, would be, actually, there's probably a lot of NED pay reviews that are overdue that could be done as part of, an overall review of remuneration.
Can I just add a couple of things on it? I mean, this is a difficult area for all boards because, of course, under the code, if you're a listed company, you can't be involved in setting your own pay. So we have this curious situation, which many people find difficult to understand, where a subset of the board called the Remuneration Committee sets the pay for some members of the board, and they specifically set the pay for the chairman and for the executive directors. And then separately, the board, excluding those who have a conflict of interest, set the pay for the non-executive directors. And that means it's the chairman plus the executive directors set the pay for the non-executive directors. So quite often at year end, you've got this dance around about whether the chairman's going to get any kind of rise or the non-executives. And if the chairman gets a pay rise or a fee rise and the non-execs don't, does that imply they haven't done their job well enough, etc.? But I think there's also a far more emotional issue around all of this at the moment. And that is, for non-executive directors, even if they've got increased workflow, to see them getting a 10 or 15% or 20% increase in fees in a time when an organization might be making redundancies, or the share price might have been particularly volatile, or as we mentioned earlier, dividends have been suspended may not go down very well with the general class of shareholders. So I think even though a review might be warranted, I think communicating clearly why this is the year to increase fees is going to be a challenge.
I think the same is true, isn't it? I mean, we just talked about some of the changes people are making in terms of performance targets. In a year where you're trying to keep people, most people are working extraordinarily hard to keep businesses thriving and having to be innovative, having to think in very complex situations with information changing on a daily basis. So the workload for non-execs as well as execs has gone up quite substantially. But there is also a requirement to keep a long-term perspective. So that's the difficult dance, I guess, that the Remuneration Committee has to play. Really, is how do you manage that long-term view with the obvious changes in the short term, which are impacting on the way people live and work. And it's quite a complex dance, I think. It's an emotional one. It's also quite a number of different stakeholders to take into account. I wanted to bring you back to the stakeholder question, and I wondered if you had any, don't necessarily name names, but examples or sort of trends in terms of how boards are dealing with the employee representation. I mean, it seems from my point of view, most boards are nominating a non-executive director to be the sort of employee representative rather than putting an employee on a board. But I'm interested in your views.
Yes, well, as Patrick mentioned, Capita went out to look for, from employees, a non-executive director. In fact, they appointed two in the end because they thought the quality was so good. One of the bus companies has had an employee representative non-exec for many years as a result of the merger. But most of the organizations have nominated a non-executive director, or in some cases the chairman, to be the individual that will represent the views of employees back to the board. Others have taken a slightly different variation. They have actually built on some kind of worker representative grouping that they might already have within the organization. And they've extended the remit of that, and then allocated one or two non-executives who will regularly attend in order to get the views back to the board. So I think it's evolving. I think the appointment of a non-executive director to represent it was probably, for some organizations, a bit of a holding period. Let's try that and see how it works. It's going to be very interesting again to see the communication on this, but also back to your point really, Ali, about the long term, because it's not just about paying rations for the executives that the remuneration committees have to take into account. It's the wider workforce. And for the wider workforce in many organizations, this is now not about pay per se. It's about how do I get my microphone to work properly when I'm on a Zoom call, as I've just found out. Have I got the right quality of computer at home? Have I got the study material? So organizations are also thinking around either direct support to employees or increasing flexible benefit provision so that employees can take some of their pay and allocate that. It used to be they allocated it to a bicycle so they could cycle in London. Well, maybe it will be to other things as we go forward.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting.
And just in terms of how they are communicating with employees around remuneration, do you see that happening? Are you observing that? I mean, I know we're interested to see what comes out in annual reports, but is it really happening? Are remuneration committees really seeking views on CEO pay?
One interesting development, I think, and it's sort of still in its early days, is the not explosion, I'd say, but the big growth in what are called next gen boards. So boards from people within the organization and some outside of a younger generation. So if you look at Gucci, FT, Interbrand, lots of boards now have a sort of next gen board, and what they've been doing is getting those next gen boards get the board papers that the board would get. They give input to that. They may the chair of the next gen board may attend board meetings from time to time, or they may have a combined discussion on a particular topic. I'm not aware yet, although they will shortly, I think, because a lot of these have happened in the last year or so, or a bit longer in Gucci's case. I'm not aware yet that they've been involving those next gen boards in, you know, remuneration sort of discussions, but I suspect they will. You know, to date, they've been far more connected around strategy, around employee well-being, around digital, around, you know, lots of things. And I imagine they'll get to that. But I know we have, you know, in one board I'm on, you know, we have someone from that sort of group involved, and you know, we talk to them about REM openly. There's also, you know, the culture of the organization, and I think we haven't talked about culture yet, but I think remuneration policy and the way you pay your top team can have, you know, a real underpinning of a good positive culture, or it can be really destructive of culture. And I think when you're making these decisions, you should be thinking, what will this do to our culture as well? Will it make it more divisive? Will it strengthen it? Will it make people aspire? It's interesting, I was talking to one young person the other day who said, you know, who was sort of 2 below main board, and they were basically saying, you know, the last thing I want is for them to start hacking back on exec pay just as I get there. So you've got to take, you know, we are all human in the end.
I think there's been some really interesting developments as a result of COVID on the communication front. So, for example, one of my clients based in central London, you know, the first lockdown in March, everybody goes home, and they think, well, it's going to, how long is it going to last? Not quite sure. But they have ended up with not quite weekly surveys, but very short, focused surveys out to employees about all sorts of issues. You know, their health, their safety, how they're feeling, do they want to come back to the office, what would make it more useful for them, you know, safe. Of course, in central London, it's slightly unusual. A lot of people are worried about whether or not the underground is safe, or when will it be safe again to come back into London. So I think actually as a result of COVID, not just the appointment of NEDs to represent employees, but as a result of COVID, a lot of companies are interacting with employees on a far more focused and regular basis. And I think that will have an impact gradually. As I say, maybe on flexible benefits initially and the provision of other things to employees, but I think over time, it will also impact on pay. I mean, one of the areas that, it's a small one maybe in some ways, pensions. There's been over the last few years a view, and also within the code, that the pension provision for executives, if they get a cash allowance instead of a pension, and a lot of them used to get 20% or 25%, that it should be in line with the wider workforce, which can be 5, 10, 15%, depends on what sector you're in, etc. And there's been a fast movement in the FTSE 100 and a slow movement outside of the FTSE 100. I think we're going to see quite a fast completion of that movement this year or next year as we get more alignment with the workforce. And I think this alignment with the workforce really is going to take root as a result of COVID.
Yeah, so some really positive trends. I wonder if we might just ask the audience, actually, we've got a poll around to what extent executive pay policy is aligned to how the rest of the organisation is rewarded. I wonder if Leslie might put that poll up. That would be interesting to see people online. So there's the poll. To what extent is your executive pay policy aligned to how the rest of the organisation is rewarded? We can't vote, sadly.
Is ours aligned?
I demand a recount. Yeah. Are these fair poll questions? Will you accept the results, Sean?
And then when we've seen the results of the poll, I'm going to ask you both about anomalies. You know, we've talked before a little bit about some of the anomalies in remuneration. So roles that are particularly hard to recruit for, both on the board and in the executive. How are we doing with the results, Leslie? Here we go. Somewhat aligned. Okay, so not very aligned. Sort of middle ground. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's reasonably positive, isn't it? With yeah, sort of 61% totally or somewhat. That's not that bad, and only 4% not aligned at all. You might expect, because of the discontinuity and disruptiveness at the moment, that might be different.
Well, although maybe it's a little bit of support for what you've been saying around these sort of positive trends, and perhaps the trend over the last few years, particularly with increased shareholder activism around executive pay, is perhaps beginning to pay off.
And I think it might change gradually. I mean, again, if you look at the listed market, not very many organizations cascade their long-term incentive plan all the way down the organization. And of course, if you're a global company, that may be completely appropriate. Some do, usually smaller companies. But a lot of companies do have these restricted share plans that I mentioned earlier, below board level. So employees get awarded some shares and they release with or without performance conditions after a period of time. I mean, if you're in the high-tech sector, they might be released on a monthly basis if you're in California. But I think if UK PLC companies go to some version of restricted share plans at the top level, I can imagine that they could quite easily be cascaded down the organization with only minor tweaks. And I think that would help both for people to feel that they're part of the same team, but also that they are in it together as the share price moves up and down. So maybe not quite aligned at the moment, but there are opportunities as we go forward.
On the anomalies point, Ali, I think the ones I've seen have been mostly around digital. So you may have had this year, many companies have had to do the sort of digital pivot, or whatever the description they use, the sort of to describe that. And the digital teams have been absolutely, really flat out, and many have really transformed the company's fortunes as a result. They get to the end of the year, and overall the company's had to invest in that as well. So financial return for the year likely to be down, even though they're sort of they're now in a good, more robust position. It's very difficult to turn to your digital transformation person and say, and so along with everyone else, you're not going to get anything extra this year. So I think I've seen and heard conversations around that the most. I think of all the executive positions, that's the one where people have thought. And similarly, I think for HR, a lot of HR directors have had just the most sort of fulfilling year of their lives, or the most awful year of their lives, whatever way you want to view it. But I think there's some positions that have actually saved a company or got it on a much better path now. And there's always that juxtaposition, isn't there, between how the company has done and how you have done. And you just have to sometimes accept. But that's where I think, again, these deferral and restricted share plans can help a lot, because you can give, and it may be part of your retention strategy for a digital person, to, instead of giving them a load of money, give them a load of stock.
In fact, I think digital, whatever we mean by digital, and that's part of the difficulty, are certainly in play at the moment. I was talking to one chief executive of a property company who was explaining, actually, he thinks that even though they own a significant part of central London, that maybe they're not in property anymore. What they really are in is web big data analysis, because what a lot of their shops and pubs want to know is profile of individuals who come into their entities and where else they shop within the area. And they can get that information from people like Visa, because they collect all the information by different groupings of people, and then can analyze where they spend the money. So if they spend 3 hours in the West End, what shops are they actually going to? How much are they spending in each one? And this organization is actually now doing more by accessing big data and providing that information to individual shops to help them in their planning. At least they were doing it before COVID turned down. But I think that in itself is very interesting commentary on what is the strategy of business and what kind of people, what skills do you need around the board table. So it's definitely evolving.
Yeah, I mean, and sophistication in how you use data for decision making is increasingly important in most businesses, and is really starting to shift a lot of business models. Now we've got a question here from Cliff Waite, which I would really like you to answer, because I think it's a good case study question that's going to get you to nail your tail on the donkey. So Ocado, maybe the only tech company in the FTSE 100, now 17 billion market cap. Shareholders have done very well from investing in Ocado. Good, very good investment. Are the panel comfortable with the £70 million CEO pay? If yes, why is Ocado okay, but Persimmon 100 million payout not? Who's going to go first?
Oh, I think this is definitely one Sean needs to go first.
Well, thank you, Patrick. I think this gets to a little dilemma that a confusion that people have all the time, and that is around, are we paying the CEO to do a CEO job, a particular role, as hired help, if I put it that way, and I'm not being derogatory, but that's what they are, or are we paying some individuals and rewarding them because they happen to be the founder of the business, and they're still there, and they happen to be running it as CEO? And directly to Cliff's point, no, I don't think it's really justified on the face of it. And the difference between, I guess, at least in the public perception, there seems to be a difference in the commentary that Persimmons had an individual who was, using my terminology, hired help, whereas in Ocado, there is a founder who's done wonderful things for shareholders over the years. The reality is that founder is getting rewarded by his shareholding and his dividends. And I think then rewarding him again via his remuneration package as a CEO, outside of what you would normally pay any other CEO, is not really fair. And so I think remuneration committees need to be very careful about what are they rewarding. Why are they paying individuals? You shouldn't confuse them being a founder and being a CEO.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, my view is I don't know is the genuine answer, because I don't know how much of that 70 million is through, you know, the equity bit, so being a shareholder as opposed to being the CEO. And I'll give you another example. It's very close to home to me. You know, at 3i, when Simon Borrows became CEO, he'd done, you know, spectacularly well before. He invested 15 million of his own cash in the company at that point, and it was a difficult time for the company. Today, you know, clearly he receives a fairly big dividend from that, and it seems slightly unfair to criticize. He takes a sort of market-based salary and bonus, but actually his biggest income is from that dividend. It seems slightly unfair to criticize someone who put his own cash sort of and invested that way, whereas someone who's maybe been brought in and had options might be different. I think also it depends on the nature of the business. You know, Ocado is in sort of mid-market supermarket, online delivery. You know, as far as I know, its customers are very happy, its shareholders are very happy, it's made a lot of money, it's done a lot of other goods, social good as well. If that's more equity based, then it might be fair, but if it isn't, then it isn't. I think it's quite a different case to Persimmon.
Okay, so really the fairness, I think fairness is a word that both of you have used quite a lot. And I'm just wondering, Sean, perhaps I could come to you when you are advising, acting as a sounding board for Remcos. What do you find to be some of the bigger challenges in terms of how people think through the fairness question?
I think that it's very easy to get swept up on the current outturn for the year. And, you know, we have an incentive plan. It's got very specific performance measures within it. We've met the performance measures, and therefore it's all hunky-dory. And we don't want to demotivate the top team, and we'll all move forward quite happily. Whereas I think the move by the code to say you take into account the wider workforce is a very positive step forward. It depends exactly how the Remco does that, what information they get, and in how much detail. But I think the fairness is really around, in the current environment, I guess, when you think around it, it's the employee journey for the last year and what's it likely to be in the next year. It's also the shareholder feeling. Did they get the dividend or not get the dividend? If you got government support, you know, the supermarkets have been all over the press this week and criticized by some for taking certain support and then paying it directly out in dividends, etc. So I think you've got to take into account a lot more than just the business performance and the performance measures that happen to be within your incentive plan. This puts a big focus and a big emphasis on use of discretion, or judgment, as it's more often referred to these days. Discretion has got a perception that Remco's only use discretion to increase the award to individuals. But I think use of judgment and explaining what you took into account in getting to that judgment.
Okay, so that ability to really be able to tell the story in a way which is open and honest and transparent, and keeping your eye on the long, the current, but the long term as well. So it's sort of real kind of balanced perspective, I think, is what you're saying.
Yes, and in a way, Cliff has put in a follow-up question, which is about why does NASDAQ and S&P outperform FTSE 100? Who would want to invest in UK market with its lack of invention?
I think it's incentivization.
Yes, of executives. But I think that there's a difference in culture. Patrick said that we hadn't talked much about culture, but there is a slight difference in culture between the UK and maybe some parts of Europe and the US, for example. The US has a focus on the hero CEO. And, they're appointed the CEO and the chairman, and then they go and select their board of directors, and they get rewarded to be that hero CEO. Whereas I think we've had a culture in the UK that maybe has been distorted a bit by executive pay, but taken into account the workforce, how we're going. And that maybe is why originally incentive plans were more like a profit share plan, going way back 25 years. If we made money at the end of the year, everybody got an opportunity to share in it. And then we've kind of moved away from that to something far more sophisticated. So I think the UK incentive market, we're at a transition. We've been coming down this path for a little while, but I think COVID is going to push it even more. We will get into simplifying arrangements, and we will get more information at remuneration committees about the wider workforce. And there will have to be far more communication by the chair of the remuneration committee to shareholders and employees about what judgment was used in the year to arrive at the outcome.
There's a good joke about American remuneration as well. The sort of American approach to remuneration is a very balanced one. Want more of everything. More salary, more bonus, more equity incentives. I know, having worked in Silicon Valley, it's just it's a different culture, and it's a very different market, I think.
Hey, before we alienate the that part of the world, Francois Seguat has asked board and CEO remuneration versus accounting for growth practices. I think that's really what we've just been talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. The other one's quite interesting. Can we touch on linking ESG to pay? Do you think we'll see more companies incorporating ESG measures into annual bonus or step? But I think this is happening. So I think when you look at a lot of the CEO objectives, if you're a chair, there's financial performance, strategic objectives, but increasingly, I've been hearing about ESG goals as well. Are we achieving those ESG goals? And those are sometimes just embedded in the basic performance measures. So I think we're seeing that. We're seeing that in car companies. I think you've seen that. I think you've seen it in some manufacturing businesses. You've seen it in some food businesses. I think I haven't looked, but I imagine Unilever and a number of its peers in that group who've been sort of more progressive on ESG will have that there. I don't know that's a fact, but I'm imagining from some of the things I've attended and the way they've talked that they are. Because they're in other people's objectives and REM objectives as well. So you'd have to think they would be in the CEOs.
Yes, and I think we have seen an increase, although ESG objectives seem to be around 10, 12% of the incentive arrangements. The big challenge that has come from shareholders is how measurable are you? And how clear are you when you set the target at the beginning of the year that this is a measurable target? And can you communicate more to us around arriving at your decision at the year end? So I think there is more of a push. There's also a push by the FRC. There was a release in the last week or so around the disclosure in respect of climate change, etc., within annual accounts as we go forward. So I think we're going to see not only more disclosure, but more use of ESG.
And interesting, I mean, a number of companies have made race commitments this year, and I think that's an obvious one where, you know, they've made race commitments in terms of proportions of staff at different levels and so on, and that's a very easy thing to measure. And I think, you know, I can imagine as we run up into the objectives for 2021 discussions, which have already started happening, I think you'll see those in there as well. Whether they will be publicly disclosed, I don't know.
I think one of the things is just the transition. So one of the big oil companies introduced an ESG measure. I haven't got it in front of me, but a year in the last 9 months. And they initially got applauded because 10% of the annual bonus plan for the top executives against a very specific ESG measure. However, they then got criticized about 3 weeks later because 30% of their bonuses increase in market share in old-fashioned oil. So there's this sort of, as they move from one offering to the market into something else, and they change the balance of their business, how can they make that work for both the old business, which is the cash flow, into the new business? But we're on a journey on it.
Yeah. Interesting question here, talking about journeys around, it's been suggested, so Natalie Waller, thank you. It's been suggested that remuneration across all staff, including, should be reduced, given that staff, including directors, have reduced expenses whilst working from home. Could you touch on this?
Well, was it one of the German companies came out this week or last week to strongly say that there should be a tax on employees because they're no longer commuting, or they're not commuting as much as they were before. I think that's an interesting concept. I think a lot of people will potentially say, yes, I'm not commuting, but I've had to upgrade my IT system or my office from home, etc. But yeah, I think this is a discussion yet to be had, to be honest, in most remuneration committees or around most board tables. At the moment, I think the discussion is around survival and how many people will be here in a year, rather than the structure of their package and whether we touch any of their current arrangements.
Yeah, I think this is quite interesting. I suspect that statement didn't win a lot of staff engagement points, but also, I mean, I've always thought you're paying for someone to do a job, not from where they come from to do that job. So logically, it sort of felt a bit odd for me. And I've always thought, you know, if someone wants to commute 2 hours into work, you know, they bear that cost. So I'm not sure why we should. I thought it was very, very odd thing. And I think Sean is right. I think a lot of people have had to make investments, and there were a lot of people who are going to have to move to be able to work from home in a sustainable way. You know, you've got a large number of people in this country at the moment working from the end of their bed, you know, because they're in a shared flat. And if you want them to work, you know, in a long-term sustained way, and it's around responsibility. Who's responsible for what? You know, we all make our own life choices as to where we live, and you know, all these other things that we decide. So there's a degree, I think, and I think, as Sean says, it's probably a debate that will evolve as we go through the year. And if we're all back in 18 months' time or a year or however long we all think it will be, then, you know, that might be an academic conversation, except for the fact that there'll be a step increase in the number of people working from home.
I think there is another aspect to this that hasn't really been raised much yet, and that is, in order for some companies to survive, they may well have to have an open discussion with their employees around whether they do take a 20-30% pay cut in order to keep the job and survive and move forward, rather than go down the redundancy route. So I think some of this may well come just from economics, rather than looking at whether or not they're getting overpaid because they're not commuting. There's
also a critical mass point around offices, isn't there? There's a point where it's not worth having an office, and some people want to work in an office, some people hate working from home, and some people love it. So all of this will, I think, balance out. Sorry, Ali.
Well, I was going to say, I think it comes back at the end of the day to judgment, doesn't it? Having a conversation, using good judgment about some of these things, which there aren't necessarily easy answers to, and people are definitely having to work through. Both employees and employers, to find the right way forward. And that consultation that you've referred to so much, Sean, that's changed quite a lot in many organisations through the pandemic, is a welcome change. We're kind of coming to the end of our hour. I found this a fascinating and interesting discussion. I wonder if I could ask the two of you to have a think about what recommendations you might make as a sort of final word for Remco's entering into this stage of negotiation.
Okay, shall I kick off? Well, mine are pretty high level and fairly simple. Focus on your company-specific circumstances. So what's COVID been like for your organization, for your employees, and for your shareholders? And don't just look at whether you might have had a windfall for the year. Take into account all of this in the round, which means, I think, significantly increased communication in the annual accounts and elsewhere, both with shareholders and with employees. So I think those are the two that I would point to.
Thank you.
Yeah, my advice is before you attend any Remco call, go and have a really big long walk and clear your head, because you're going to need clarity of thought and an open mind. And then when you get on the call, I think it's always important to remember what the point of remuneration is, both from incentive and reward. I always find as well, I find it helpful to forget what schemes we've got in place to start with, but then it's massively important to remember what schemes you've got in place then later. And the key thing often is, whenever people say, yep, so we're all agreed, is really make sure you've thought through all the consequences, really make sure you've thought through the communication angles of that and the perceptions of what you're doing before you decide. So it isn't one tip, but that's my approach. Clear head, first of all, most important.
Brilliant. Well, thank you to the both of you for what's been a really engaging topic. I'm sort of loving the thought about remuneration in the round and the UK leading on that, and I hope that remains to be true.
Thank you very much, all three of you. That was absolutely fascinating, and thank you all to the attendees for the questions that you put in. I hope you all found that as interesting as I did. We have recorded it. It will go up onto the governance website probably tomorrow, and we'll send you a link once that's done. But for now, I'd just like to wish you all good days and just thank you for sharing it so brilliantly, Ali, and thank you, three of you, for having such interesting views, and thank you for the joke about remuneration. Thanks a lot, everybody.